Okay, so this is an experiment for me and for us at Emergent Order. Um, 10 years ago, we started our work with YouTube in the sense that, me and my business partner, Josh, and my other business partner, Lisa, my best friend and my wife, released Fear the Boom and Bust, which is the first video on this channel. And so in a sense, YouTube's always been my favorite platform. It's always been the place I turn to when I've got nothing else to do, frankly. And so in this time where we're all stuck at home, and I'm a high production value kind of guy, so I'm always looking for ways to create content that's interesting. I thought, we've underutilized talking to all the folks who've subscribed to the YouTube channel, and I thought now's as good a time as any to re-engage with people and just sort of lift the kimono on some of the ways that we do what we do at Emergent Order, and start being a little more experimental. And so that's what this is all about. So if my A7 III craps out, that's just part of the process. I think I've got it all rigged pretty well. I usually work with bigger crews than just me, but this is fun for me too. On a totally side note, when we first did Fear the Boom and Bust, I've always been a gearhead. So we shot it with Canon 7D, which was this new camera at the time. And so this is probably the most fun part of this kind of thing for me, is getting to experiment with the technology and make use of autofocus that actually works. And so that's all really fun. For those of you that are starting to log in, I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible. And so I'll be paying attention to the comments. And for those of you that watch this after the fact, I hope you get value out of it. As I said, 10 years ago, we released Fear the Boom and Bust on January, I think it was the January 28th, 2010. So it's been a decade of trying to tell big idea stories through video. Me and Josh and Lisa, our backgrounds were in television. I met my wife, Lisa, at Nickelodeon, where we were doing promos for the network. And Josh and I have been making videos together since 5th grade, but we went to film school together and we worked together at Nickelodeon, and then we worked together again at Spike. So that was our background. And, our company and this YouTube channel was born in crisis because, we were at a turning point in our own lives at that point in 2009 and 2008 and 9. We were old enough that we were getting married and having kids and having mortgages, paying interest rates on those mortgages. And so when the financial crisis happened, it was a captivating and terrifying experience for us. We were working in New York City. We were in New York for 9/11, and we were in New York for the Northeastern blackout. So we sort of had these crisis experiences in New York City for over a decade together. And I think those things combine to create a feeling that, maybe there's more we can do than just promote SpongeBob or the Guy's Choice Awards. And Josh and I had started spending our lunch breaks talking about what is happening with this financial crisis and what is happening in our own lives. Where do we want to go next? Life in New York is actually pretty challenging. It's an expensive place to live. And even when you're doing pretty well by most standards, you are not always living that great. You're living great when you're young because you can get out there and make use of all the city has to offer. But once you have kids, it sort of changes the game for your relationship with New York City. And for me, that had happened. It hadn't happened for Josh yet, but he was talking about it. And so that was part of the first life transformation, that when you look at the backdrop of the financial crisis, sort of was this like awakening moment a decade ago. And I think we're going through another moment like that now, right? We've got layers of crisis. We've got this pandemic, which has hit all of us really hard. It's certainly hit our little family business hard, but we're still standing for now. But it's hit a lot of people way harder than us, and my heart really goes out to people who are really in a difficult spot because of what's happened with the coronavirus and the lockdowns and everything that's happened. And I've been pretty vocal on Facebook about what I think was an overreaction in some respects, but I also have to come at this with a lot of humility. And one of the reasons why I wanted to start doing this on YouTube was that I've noticed something about myself as a creative person and as a communicator. And that is that social media is can kind of bring out the worst in you. And I've been thinking about, like, why is that? Why do Facebook posts and tweets tend to make you not your best self, maybe even your worst self? And what can we do about that? And what should we do about it? Because these platforms are super engaging, and they've broken down all the barriers to our ability to create content and to tell stories and to engage with audiences and to build livelihoods for ourselves in totally new ways that were only ever possible in a handful of opportunities before. And now they're open to everybody. And I think one of the things is, and it's something that the coronavirus crisis has brought into really stark contrast, how much human contact sort of regulates our behavior, and how much looking somebody in the eye and physically in their presence, not me looking at a lens, making it try to feel like I'm looking at you, the viewer, but actually looking you as a person in the eye across from me. There's like biological things that happen. There's a neurochemical called oxytocin. It's called the trust hormone or the bonding hormone that kicks in when you look people in the eye, when you have a conversation. It's part of the underlying mechanisms of building trust and building relationships. When a baby is born and is the mother makes eye contact, oxytocin just floods the head, and it creates that it's part of what we understand, or we think we understand, about what creates that bond. That doesn't happen on digital platforms. It doesn't happen in a Zoom or a FaceTime video, even when you're looking kind of somebody sort of in the eye, and you almost feel like it's present. It definitely doesn't happen on Twitter, and it doesn't happen on Facebook. And so we sort of give away some of our human tools, these biological, sociological, social tools, when we, or I guess psychological tools, when we engage on these platforms. When you see something in your news feed and bloviate, and I'm talking about me here, bloviate about, like, here's why I think we've gone over the top on the lockdowns, or why we should be more like Sweden or less like Sweden, or whether it's more like Sweden on some respects, and we're all obsessed with Sweden one way or another. So I don't know why, but Sweden's at the top of everybody's mind for everything all the time. We want to be more like Sweden economically or less. We want to be more like Sweden on pandemic response or less. Lovely country. I don't think it's got as many lessons for a diverse 330 million person society like America as any of us want it to. But when you do that, when I do it, and I'm on Facebook and I write, and in some respects, it's probably some of my better copywriting because it's pithy and punchy, and I'm angry and I'm upset and I'm trying to get a response. And then you see all those comments flood in. There's no oxytocin going on there, but there is dopamine. There is these little hits, probably we've all heard it, these little sort of pops of joy, of pleasure when you see people responding and liking and sharing and engaging. And I think we're grappling with that as a society, how to deal with these dopamine hits, these digital dopamine hits. And I don't think we're even at the start of fully grasping the implications of these platforms. I think, one of the other things that's become really a focus of mine is our relationship to fear, which is another thing that's happening right now that's really intense. And that, fear is this potent emotion, this potent physiological response to stimulus, to events, to information. And I'm going to talk more about that later, but I think that we have never been subjected to as much fear as we have in the past 10 years for sure, but it's continues to escalate. And I think that we have a certain algorithmic optimization of our response to fear going on, but which has made a lot of things in our society, I think, worse. And so, a year ago, I started doing a podcast, the Emergent Order podcast, and the audio from this stream is going to be included in that. And and the reason why I did that was to start to break away and focus my energies on something where I could have that human interaction and that human contact rather than this sort of sniping back and forth on Facebook. I see a kind of a silly comment about Apple being racist. Yes, I've got the Apple logo. For any of you that have known me for a long time know that I am probably more obsessively fanboyish about Apple than I am about economics. And one of the reasons why I started to get into economics actually was because I always loved to debate. I've loved to debate since I was a kid. And my wife, Lisa, noticed that I was spending an unhealthy amount of time after hours engaging in debates about Mac versus PC, which is something that dates all the way back to high school for me, before the World Wide Web was fully a thing, like AOL chat room, CompuServe type stuff, just to date me. I'm 42. So I was around. My childhood didn't involve the internet. Me and Josh would play video games that weren't connected to each other, so we had to be in the same room to play together. And actually, the funny thing was, in a sense, it was my first experience of sort of the zealotry of a convert, because Josh and I built PCs together. I was a hardcore PC all the way straight through college. Cyclone 8974, PC 100%. Well, I'm with you at one level, because we used to build gaming PCs when Josh and I went to Penn State together, and the first thing we did when we got to our dorm, this is 1995. This is like September 1995. Long time ago, and 25 years ago, and we had to find an Ethernet cable to what was called a patch cable. I don't know if you even still use that term, but it's an Ethernet cable with a twist in it so that you can connect two computers and they'll talk to each other, so that we could play, maybe it was Doom or Castle Wolfenstein or something connected with a high-speed connection. I mean, this was the most exciting first thing about going to college, was having fast internet. I mean, this was the era where a 56K kilobaud modem, there we go, yeah, crossover cable, where that was fast. And so, all through college, we built PCs. The other hobby I had all throughout that, because we were making videos since grade school. Maybe we'll even post some of those old grade school ones on the YouTube channel, as embarrassing as they are, because we were doing sort of political commentary in high school, really schlocky, terrible political commentary in high school. But that was it. That I was a passionate PC guy. I actually started off in computer science at Penn State, not in film or entertainment or communications. So I've always had this left and right brain thing going on. I started off in computer science, was a PC guy. Josh was all in going to film right from the beginning. I switched majors to film, and then we were in film school together and made a bunch of like silly little college movies. What's amazing these days is when you look on YouTube, there are like middle school kids whose YouTube videos are better than our senior thesis film. I mean, the explosion of incredible creativity that's happened and that can be done entirely with your mobile phone is so sort of crazy for those of us that have kind of lived through, 25 years, 30 years of technological change that's happened on this front. But when I got out of school, I got a job at MTV in the series development department. It was the guys that did Beavis and Butthead, the animation team. And I was making $500 a week working in New York City, commuting from New Rochelle. So I was not really able to get by. So I spent that first 2 years out of my career basically accumulating credit card debt until the .com bust. And during that 2-year period where I was set in front of an iMac, and this was not like modern Unix OS 10, like Mac OS as it is today. That's like pretty bulletproof and stable and great. And, you go into an airport and half the computers you see are Apple. This is 1999. Apple is on the verge of death. They've released the iMac. Steve Jobs is back, but they're like an also-ran. And I am a PC guy. And what made me into a Mac fanatic was how productive I was on these Apple computers. There was no worrying about the tech. And I knew the tech. I might struggle a little to build a Windows PC today, but thanks to YouTube, I could watch a video and get caught up on, the process for updating the BIOS or whatever might still work. I don't know what the latest tech is on that front. But I got a chance to do a sort of side project while I was working as a PA. MC McVideocast, it is still the same. Well, that's unfortunate. My son is using an old Mac Pro as a gaming PC. And so in a way, Macs make great PCs because the boot camp drivers just kind of do it all. So it doesn't give you the full PC experience, for better and worse. But I've told him, I said, look, just for fun, I will build a gaming PC with you if you do all the research and pick the parts, and I'll give you a budget, and then I'll just sort of be floating behind to watch you do it. But I had this opportunity to work on a show that some of you might remember called Little Bill. And Little Bill, it's funny now because it was Little Bill Cosby. So a lot has happened in the past 20 years. But it was a kids program about Little Bill Cosby in Philadelphia. I'm a Philadelphian. And it was animated sort of like the way South Park is. It was one of the early sort of puppet animation, digital puppeteering animated shows. Blue's Clues did this. Little Bill did it. South Park took it to another level in terms of the fast turnaround that they were able to achieve. But I had this opportunity to work essentially nights and weekends doing After Effects. And there was a test that they gave prospects for this freelance opportunity. It was an After Effects file where you would, have to animate Little Bill, like walking along in a scene. And there was a technique called mouth replacement, which I'm weirdly still good at doing, where, you nest the way, if you've never seen it, Adobe After Effects, it's sort of like Photoshop in the sense that there's layers of graphic elements. And then the way you can animate characters, and I think this has gotten a lot better since I used to be good at After Effects because I'm no longer good at it, or I'm no longer up to date, is you sort of take all these layers, the head, the body, the upper arm, lower arm, wrist, and then you sort of associate them with each other, and it become this like puppet where you'd move the arm, and then you could move this part of the arm, and you could also like replace parts. So if you're getting the lips to sync, you'd have a bunch of different mouths, and you'd turn them on and off, and it would. I think the term is phenoms. The little like ooh, like 5 or 6 of these, and you could make a lip sync happen. And so that was the other part of the test. Well, this is a total diatribe off to down the rabbit hole I've gone already. But I brought this test home. They were Macintosh files, and they wouldn't open. They wouldn't open partly because they didn't have file extensions, because the old Mac OS didn't use the .jpg or didn't need to use them. It had sort of invisible data for what this type of file you had. And the Windows PCs didn't know what to do with these files. And so that was problem number one. But problem number two is when I went to actually try to like fix the files, get the After Effects project to open, my Windows PC crashed, and I spent the weekend not trying to animate Little Bill, but reinstalling Windows. And so I didn't get this opportunity, an opportunity that actually would have made it so that I wasn't going into deeper and deeper debt every week. And because you got to remember, $500 a week is not a lot of money. $500 a week is $26,000 a year. That's in New York City. And after tax, it was something like $320,000 a week, $320 a week. So that was pretty tight. Like the idea of like $15 minimum wage, when I think about where I started at the bottom of the barrel at MTV, is lesson number one of live streaming: turn off your phone. This was like a super important moment for me. So even though I didn't have any money, I found a way. I basically bought a G4 Mac on credit card and switched it home and like said goodbye to the PC and never looked back. And I've been like an Apple acolyte ever since. So all of Emergent Order runs on Apple tech. It is pretty bulletproof, and there are things about it when it comes to just basic workflows that I just would defend to the end. And I know Apple's had ups and downs, and they're not a perfect company. And I love this shirt, first of all, because it fits me, but also, like, Josh actually got this because he went and gave a talk about our movie The Pursuit that he edited in Final Cut Pro 10 at the Apple campus. And so he got this at the Apple campus. And one of the highlights of our time at Nickelodeon actually was we got to be given a, quote, executive briefing, which was maybe overstating our role at Nickelodeon at the time, where me, Josh, and our other college buddy, Jeremy, who was working with us, and another producer, director, Quasi, got to go to the Apple campus, and we met Bud Tribble and the guys behind Final Cut and QuickTime. And I actually got to see Steve Jobs and Jonathan Ive walk through the One Infinite Loop hallway. Like, you come into the original Apple campus and there's like this big vestibule with this high arched ceiling, and they came out of this elevator off to the side, and we're sort of huddled with like the QuickTime nerds talking about I don't know what. So Jobs and I've come out of the elevator, and I make brief eye contact with Steve Jobs, and my response is a window into my goofy nature. Because here's what I did. I literally waved at him like a goofball. And the engineers and everyone around us were like, what is he doing? Why is he doing this? I didn't care. I didn't work for Apple. I know he had a wrath that he could rain down upon you, which is not a quality I think is either necessary or valuable in business. I don't think you need to be a tyrant or a terror to get good work out of people. I think that's a bad way to go, but I think it's one of the worst things about the aftermath of Steve Jobs' unbelievable success is that some people actually thought that his weaknesses were a strength. But nonetheless, that's sort of that's the Apple. That's my passion for Apple. I have like this passion engine, and its first target was Mac versus PC. First for PC, then for Mac. And so I have I know what it means to have the zealotry of a convert. So zooming all the way back, my wife Lisa sees me spending all this time, and she says, look, you've got to find a more productive, something that advances your interests more than like being essentially like free PR for Apple. I mean, I know you love Apple, I know it's fun, but there's got to be something else you can do with yourself. So I started listening initially to history books, actually, because I had this massive commute. And I listened to the Ben Franklin biography and realized, wow, like I didn't like history in school, but history is actually pretty amazing. Textbooks are not fun or interesting. They're dry and horrible, and you have to, memorize dates and everything about school to me has kind of been put in a blender in my mind over the years. But I came to really get excited about American history and about the founding. And I read the David McCullough, John Adams book, which became the HBO series with, the actor's name is escaping me, Italian actor. He's in billions now. But so I'm putting my brain to use, and the financial crisis starts to happen. And so I turned that energy into economics. I had started to become interested in Ron Paul. And so my cousin Bill, who's my Facebook sparring partner, said, all the stuff you're reading and what you're saying, you kind of sound like a libertarian. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. He's like, well, do you like Ron Paul? And I was like, I don't know who Ron Paul is. He's 13 years old at this point. He knew more about politics than I did when I was in my 20s or 30s. And he was like 13, 14 years old. So, I Google Ron Paul, which was actually like a bit of an early meme in the 2006, 2007 time period, Google Ron Paul. And like, it was through that I found out about Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek had this story about what happens that causes these booms and busts. And that story sounded a whole lot like what we were going through. And that was that, essentially, excessively easy money, so the Fed sort of printing more money than it should, causes this distortion in the economy, like across the entire economy, where you get a kind of boom of investment in projects that aren't actually sustainable. They don't mesh with the real needs of where people are in terms of their desires to save and invest and their incomes and their plans. You get this sort of distortion, like a ripple. And the interest rates are one of the ways that process gets rippled out. So if you're in 2005 and interest rates have come way, way down because of easy money, in part from the Federal Reserve. Well, what happens when interest rates are low? Well, it's cheaper to mortgage homes. It's cheaper to borrow money on expensive projects. And so you get this boom. And then the question is, well, why can't the boom just go on forever? Why can't you just keep printing money and let the boom keep going? And the reason was that, as I think either Mises or maybe Roger Garrison says, that or maybe it was Murray Rothbard. These were all people I was starting to read. As that money makes its way out into the economy, and people start to, invest in these things that are more interest rate sensitive, like housing and heavy industry and manufacturing, you start to run up against reality. And so you get inflation. So that spending translates into inflation, which is what we saw in 2005 and 6. You saw housing prices going up because of all the demand. You saw like the prices of the raw materials that go into building a house going up like crazy. They were importing concrete from China to build houses in 2005 and 6. Copper was being ripped out of job sites because of how high copper prices had gone. And then in 2008, one of the things that really confused policymakers was, even as the economy was turning south, there were the gas prices topped $4 a gallon in summer of 2008, and food prices were causing like global riots. Like rice and basic commodities were going crazy. And this is what happens as the money gets out there into the economy, and it doesn't just happen like pouring water in an ice tray. It happens because of that bidding process. Okay, I've gotten a loan now to build a house. I'm going to go out there and buy the materials to build the house. Oh, you also got a loan to build a house. The lumber yard is running low on lumber. They're going to increase their price. This is the actual like mechanical underlying process that gives rise to the rising prices. So, and as the prices rise, I mean, these are like lyrics out of Fear the Boom and Bust, The grasping for resources reveals there's too few, so the boom turns to bust. As a matter of fact, now it's devalued capital that makes up the slack. I can't believe I still remember the lyrics. But this story of how this happened, why the boom across the whole economy, why a boom in housing across multiple countries, what would coordinate it? This, what, like, I think Murray Rothbard called, like, the cluster of errors, all in the same direction. And it was that unlikelihood that everyone all around the world will be wanting houses at the exact same time that led a lot of people to say, well, there's never been a housing boom the way this is. This, you could find articles in 2007 saying this is the greatest economy we've ever had in the history of the world. 2007, January 2020, you name it, we've got these stories. And so this crisis that happens 10 years ago, really 12, was like an eye-opening thing for me. It was like I went down this rabbit hole of trying to understand what was going on, and it was affecting us personally because we had an apartment, we had a child, we had rising cost of living. We moved further out to Jersey to try to deal with the fact that we could barely afford to keep up with our cost of living in our little apartment in Hoboken. And so we make this video, the first video of this YouTube channel, Fear the Boom and Bust. I reach out to Russ Roberts, this podcasting economist from Econ Talk, and start a collaboration in 2009 that in the aftermath of the stimulus package being passed and the general feeling that here you have this story about this Friedrich Hayek story about the causes of the boom and why it turns to bust and how we should understand the way the market economy is supposed to work. And you have basically everyone agreeing with Keynes's Friedrich Hayek's longtime rival, John Maynard Keynes, and saying, look, the problem isn't any of that stuff. Interest rates don't matter. Savings is actually bad for the economy because it reduces spending. Spending is all that matters in the economy. So we just have to keep spending going. And if individuals won't spend, then the government should sort of spend on our behalf. And there's actually like some kernels of truth in that, in a very particular technical way that I won't go into now. But by and large, it's kind of, in my personal opinion, and in the kind of nonsense. Consuming uses stuff up. That's what we do when we consume. When you consume a sandwich, you use it up. The creation of wealth is the production of the sandwich. And yes, you produce a sandwich because you're hungry, but your hunger isn't the means to create the sandwich. It's the ends, not the means. And my view and what the motivation behind Fear the Boom and Bust was that this sort of Keynesian story, this story that government can spend for us and heal the economy, that the economy is kind of like this machine or this sort of big macro circular flow, and that the underlying decisions at the individual level really don't necessarily matter. You can even dig ditches and fill them back in, and that will be good for the economy. That just didn't make any sense to me. Digging ditches and filling them back in is a waste of time. You don't get richer digging ditches and filling them back in. You don't get richer making things that nobody wants. And so these were these big ideas that give rise to Fear the Boom and Bust. And one of the things, again, sort of like what I'm trying to do with this live stream, is one of the things about the angle we took in making Fear the Boom and Bust was, yes, I think Keynes is mostly nonsense. I really do. I think the stuff in Keynes that's correct isn't original with Keynes, and the stuff that's original with Keynes isn't correct. But it's so much more interesting. It's so much more respectful. And it's so much more difficult to take the opposing point of view seriously. To say, I'm going to represent John Maynard Keynes's view in a way that Keynes himself, or at least his modern proponents, would recognize as being true, as being accurate. And if I can do that, then even though I disagree, and in this case, it's we, me and Russ, in our collaboration together, even if we disagree with Keynes, it's important to understand him. And it's important as a piece of creative work to grapple with the ideas that are challenging to your view and take them seriously. And this is an ethos that has become sort of one of the founding principles of Emergent Order as a company. We try to take on these big ideas with our projects. And even if in personal conversation, it'll be like, well, socialism's a big crock and it's never worked anywhere. We're going to spend hours and days reading Marx to try to understand the argument and interviewing Marxian economists and Marx sympathetic progressive economists to try to represent the worldview of Marx in our Mises versus Marx rap video well. And I think that that's just more interesting. And I think that is what the competition of ideas looks like at its best. And I think when you're in a crisis moment like we're in now, where there's so much heat and there's so much anger, so much fear, that this is one of the things that we have to try to find a path back to, is a path to understanding. Understanding doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't even mean, I'm not sure if tolerance is the right word or not, but I think that there's something that's been scorched in our discourse. And it's something that we've tried to preserve in our work. And I am guilty as charged that I have not preserved it on my Facebook page to near the extent that I should. I'm like exhibit A for being a hypocrite about not straw manning per se, but, pointing to politicians in particular and basically being like, well, they're evil and they want to rip us off and they're corrupt. And that's why they're doing this. They know what they're doing. And I think, sometimes even when that's true, even when the argument for that is pretty straightforward, even when you can spot hypocrisy, I've never really met anyone that was insulted into agreement or was backed into a corner on their ideas and changed their mind under that pressure. I know a lot of people who would argue for things that they themselves don't even agree with when they're backed into that kind of corner. And so I think that that's one of the founding principles that we've tried to live by in our work. I'll give you an example. Our first feature film is called At the Fork, and it's about the way animals are raised for food. And the way this project came about was through personal passion. And it wasn't my passion. In fact, it was kind of my pain in the neck, because when I first met Lisa at Nickelodeon, one of the first things she said to me was that she was a vegetarian. And this was one of the most important things for her, was animal rights. And she had sort of implored me to buy to buy Whole Foods stock. And because she was like, they're the best, they're advancing everything that I care about, they're the greatest company ever. And I, at the time, I've actually I call myself a classical liberal. I sort of was raised as a pretty much like a conservative Catholic. And in some ways I'm super radical. You could say fiscally conservative, socially liberal, whatever. But the point is, like, I've actually changed quite a bit my philosophy over the years. I was quite a bit more of a curmudgeon actually when I was younger than I am now. And so she's telling me about Whole Foods and the veggie burger and how she got the veggie burger at Burger King, which is true. Lisa did get the veggie burger at Burger King before the Impossible Whopper. The Impossible Whopper is like version 2, and it's actually pretty awesome. But and I thought, this is a bunch of BS. Like, what are you talking about? Like, we went to a dinner with an eclectic group of people. It was a really strange experience. But one of them was the founder of Garden Burger. This is going back like 25 years, 22 years, something like that. Or no, that can't be right. This is going back like 18 years. And there's this like pause in the conversation. And I say, you know what's interesting? If you didn't have hamburgers, would you ever think to turn vegetables into the shape and try to give it this particular flavor and like char broil it to be this sort of smoky taste? Like, in a way, don't you need the hamburger in order to have the veggie burger? It was like one of these step into the quiet moment and step your foot into your mouth in the quiet moment. And the founder of Garden Burger didn't seem to appreciate me accidentally saying that he owed his fortune to hamburgers, but that kind of gives you a sense of where I was coming from with all this stuff. So fast forward to us moving down to here. We live in Austin, Texas, and we get a chance to meet John Mackey, the co-founder of Whole Foods Market. And before we even moved down here, you know, I had at least become aware that John Mackey, despite being the co-founder of Whole Foods, wasn't like a crunchy commune kind of guy. I mean, he was actually, but he was like a hardcore capitalist. He's a free marketeer, and he had actually written this article in Wall Street Journal about Whole Foods healthcare, where he basically advocated for a more consumer-driven, free market style healthcare approach, and that's what he did at Whole Foods, that he did, you know, health savings accounts, that he empowered his employees to make the spending decisions rather than having it be this sort of a la carte tragedy of the commons, order whatever tests you want. I don't know what they cost, and you, the doctor, don't know either. And then why is everything so expensive? Well, because there's no prices on it thing. And for that, he got sort of vilified because, you know, a lot of folks that shop at Whole Foods, a lot of people that sort of are super enthusiastic about Whole Foods are not super free market oriented, for better or worse. So anyway, we connect with John, and we have a great interview with him on the Emergent Order podcast. So I definitely encourage you to check it out. But John and Lisa start talking about their shared enthusiasm for animal rights, and John's a philosophical vegan, and Lisa's vegan-ish. We sometimes have dairy. She never gets eggs, and out of that, this idea to do a movie is born. And this movie, which becomes At the Fork, starts with the premise that this debate about animals is polarized and sort of militarized. So you have on the right, if you will, paleo, or just like, America is about steak and beef and hamburgers, and if you know, you're just a dirty hippie if you think that this is anything other than great, and you know, we have dominion over these animals, we raise them for this purpose, like, shut up. And then on the other hand, you've got sort of PETA, you know, meat is murder, and if you eat meat, if you raise animals for food, you're basically in you know, closer to Hitler on the spectrum of bad actors than not. And that's not I don't think that's a misrepresentation. I mean, you know, and PETA's actually, I think, done a lot of really interesting and important work, but they are sort of the exemplar of the most bombastic voice for animal activism. There's actually, you know, activist organizations that are even more hardcore than PETA. I think, you know, so I don't mean to pick on PETA here in any way, actually, but you have these two sides. And even in the world of like movies about food, you have like forks over knives and various things that say veganism is the way to go. And I think there's a pretty strong argument for that on a lot of fronts, including health. And then you've got the exact opposite. And so what we wanted to do, much like we did in a sense with the rap videos, was come to the middle and say, okay, how do we explore the area in between here? And it didn't start off as a personal story. We didn't set out to have ourselves be in the movie. I have very mixed feelings about it, even though I think it worked out okay. But Lisa and I actually represented this in our own household. The only times we really get in arguments was over food. And we're both Italian, but like when I go home, my parents make sausage and they make ribs, and it's like it's embedded in like the joy of coming home to eat these foods. And so that tension was part of our exploration of this film. And so we met with farmers across the spectrum, as well as animal activists and farm sanctuary folks, and basically let them tell their story of what they do and why they do it. And if you watch the movie, what you'll find is across the spectrum from the farm sanctuaries in Northern California, in Marin County, which is the most beautiful place in the country. You can see why environmentalism is most strong in the Pacific Northwest, because it is just such beautiful country. All the way to like large scale animal agriculture operations, what's called like CAFOs or factory farms, which is it's a derisive term, but it's not wholly inappropriate. And we listen to all these folks and we let them tell their story and we show their practices with a very minimal amount of commentary. And the way the movie ends, not to spoil it, but it's really meant to be experienced. It's not some big aha. Is that no matter where you fall in the spectrum here, that you have to take that, the call to action is really that you need to take the lives of these animals into consideration, that they, that we do have dominion over them and that they're living things. And one of the things about that approach, I learned a couple different things about myself and about storytelling in these difficult times and with thorny issues that people are super viscerally engaged on. And that is that you probably get a bigger audience when you go for the extremes. We got on Amazon Prime, and I've heard from people who really love the movie, but it didn't catch fire in the way that even like What the Health did, which was like a more recent sort of conspiracy theory angle that, meat was found to be carcinogenic, but there's all these corporate bad actors that are, propping up a conspiracy. We sort of went we sort of criticized that whole mentality, that conspiracy theory approach to issues at the Fork. And I think it makes there is a sense a smaller audience for that, or at least maybe we didn't do a good enough job marketing it. But it's harder. It's harder to tell the nuanced story. But I think in the longer run, it makes the bigger impact, because the people who can take the time to be treated with respect and aren't just propagandized to. And this is not for lack of having strong positions on things, but I think, I think if you treat your audience like they're smart and tackle things with an open heart towards your opponents, you end up in a better place. And I think the challenge we face really is one of the combination of our psychology and our tribal nature and the business models that kind of prey on that, if you will. The sort of if it bleeds, it leads business model is not conducive to us sort of engaging Socratically and like coming together and grappling with things and going through the process of seeing things from the other person's point of view and seeing maybe that I not only do I, a lot of times when you engage somebody that's got a very different worldview than you not only come to learn your own ideas better, but you actually get stronger in your convictions. Even I have personal friends who are strongly on the opposite side of a lot of issues I care about. And this is left, right, and center. I mean, it doesn't, across the across the spectrum. And I think you can maintain that, and you can actually have a richer life when you make that effort. And that's like the ethos of EO. That's the ethos that we try to bring to the projects. And it's interesting because one of the things is, we're not principally like a YouTube channel in a lot of ways. We're a production company that tells stories for both clients and sometimes for originals, like with either through investors or like with Whole Foods and the Humane Society of the United States, who invested in At the Fork, or a nonprofit partners like our second major documentary film, The Pursuit, that we did with Arthur Brooks and the American Enterprise Institute. So we're always grappling with our take on issues and our clients or partners' take. And one of the things that we've generally chosen to do is we only take the projects where we are aligned on that. So we turn projects down quite a bit. Like if somebody comes to us and wants to do something that doesn't align with our values, we just say, I'm sorry, this is not for us. And so, I don't think there has to be a conflict. Upton Sinclair has this great quote, to paraphrase, something to the effect of, a man will not understand what his paycheck depends on him not understanding. And I think about that quote a lot, because when it's one thing when you are a creative director at Spike and you're making this like little YouTube video on the side, and your life doesn't depend on the position you take there. But when you build a business and a livelihood around engaging with philosophical ideas, and you work with a community of like-minded people who you're like, hey, I believe the same thing you believe, and oh yes, let's do this thing together, you inevitably run into this challenge, this Upton Sinclair challenge of, at some point, you face a strong disincentive to change your mind. Like your investors and your peers and your community that you're a part of, they wouldn't like it very much. They wouldn't keep hiring you if you said, you know what, I actually think democratic socialism's got a lot to recommend it. Like that's, like whatever issue it might be. And so that's something it's an interesting thing about, as a free marketeer, it's an interesting thing about the underlying incentives of telling stories commercially, telling stories in a way that's a career. It's when you are just being a hobbyist or an artist and you're doing something else on the side, and then you have your creative work that you do. I think it's a different thing. But even if you are, I think everyone faces this in different ways. If you're a YouTuber who builds an incredible following around your point of view, it's risky to change your view. It's risky to come out on an issue that you care a lot about that might anger your audience and alienate your audience. And so I think in this era now, this era of personality as a platform, I think we face a new kind of challenge for ourselves. To the extent anybody cares at all about what I'm doing with this little live stream, there's a pressure factor there to want to live up to your values, and also give yourself the freedom to change your mind. And I think that makes storytelling a lot harder, because in this era, and when it comes to storytelling in a time of crisis where fevers are high, and when I look out there and I see that some of this cancel culture, and when I see the ugly side of identity politics, and the extent to which our conversations increasingly just sort of devolve into name calling, I just wonder, what's the path out of that? How do we elevate each other in a time like this, where there's a lot of incentives and a lot of rewards for taking the other path and for playing to your base? I think we generally don't do any kind of work for political candidates. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's not that the work is corrupt per se. I kind of think it is corrupt because I think politics in general is kind of corrupting, but it's not conducive to doing great work. I mean, the turnaround times, everything about it. I like. It took me and Marshall like 3 months to write the Mises versus Marx lyrics. Being like, we need to come up with an ad in a week to answer this blah, like, is not conducive to the kind of creative I like to do. If I'm going to be fast turnaround, I'd rather do something like this, where it's more of a conversation and it's more like, let's get together and talk something out. And then take the time to craft something that's like a story. And so we don't do political work for that reason. But politics is steeped in this sort of this mentality, this tribal mentality. And so one of the things I hope to do as we move forward in this, we're very much in a new era right now. It's like the birth of something new. To just engage you, our audience, our subscribers, more often, because I think there's a lot we can learn and that I can learn about how to do new, interesting work that grapples with big ideas in a more inclusive and sort of flexible way. I want to talk a little bit about like what's happening right now with regard to the protests. For all of my disdain for identity politics, I am super sensitive about the fact that I am not African American. I can't really speak to the lived experience of people who feel, who have felt what it's like to be Black in America. But one of my first sort of eye-opening experiences when it comes to, I guess what you could say is sort of institutional problems in our society, is when I got out of school. I was working at MTV, and I was kind of a straight-laced kid. I didn't do drugs. I didn't, I didn't like even drink until like the senior spring break. Where me and Josh and us all went down to like Ocean City in New Jersey and, sort of, got stupid. But so when I got out of school, I was really, and I'm talking college here, I was pretty cloistered. I didn't know anything. So I start this job and I'm working in New York City, and I'm talking to a friend that talks about how it was easier for him to get cocaine in high school than alcohol. And this was shocking to me. This was like, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I said, really? He's like, oh yeah. Like we used to have these crazy parties, in Greenwich, Connecticut. And I said, well, like, how did you not, like, what if the cops showed up? He's like, oh yeah, the cops would show up sometimes and they would give us a slap on the wrist and we'd break up and go wherever. I think, what I was struck by later was learning about the other side of the tracks experience, which is what it's like to be not in Greenwich, Connecticut, but to be in Newark, New Jersey, and what that party would look like if the cops showed up in Newark, New Jersey. And it looks nothing like what happens to my buddy in Greenwich, Connecticut. And for Mike Anderson, who's just joining now, what exactly is this channel? Seems to cover a lot of things. So Mike, real quick, if you're dropping in the middle here, it's a long and winding journey, but I'm the CEO and co-founder of Emergent Order. And this YouTube channel is our company's channel. And we create content that, explores big ideas. We've done a lot of work around macroeconomics and the debates about the future of the economy. We've got projects in the works about open borders and the future of parenthood and, sort of a wide range of big topics. And so this is my first live stream and sort of a video diary, if you will, about some of the thinking that goes into the work we do and just touching on some of this current events, which is not our main sort of emphasis. We tend to try to look a little bit bigger than current events, but anyway, I digress. So I got that window into in the war on drugs being sort of systematic in its application and biased in its application. And I know that that's only like tangential to the experience um, that's taking place in the protests today. And all I can say is, I really do stand with the people who are peacefully advocating for major change. I wrote a Facebook post, and this does speak to what we're all about and the kind of ideas we like to explore. So, when I started to do start to get in economics, one of the first fundamental ideas that kind of was eye-opening for me, and is in Hayek, and it's in Mises, and you get pieces of it in the three videos, I should say, as well as in our movie The Pursuit on Netflix. Yeah, that's right. With Arthur Brooks, is this sense of trying to understand the world through the eyes of the individual. And so when economists call this methodological individualism. And what it means is you have to grapple with something that's really hard to grapple with, which is the idea that we don't choose, only individuals choose. So when you talk about things like institutions, and when you talk about institutional forces, or when you talk about America does, or America thinks, or America wants, at one level, we all kind of know what this means, like to say like America wants change, or, China does X, but at the basic level of trying to like understand the way the world works, those statements are kind of nonsense. There is no mind that is America that can want or choose or be. What there is Americans, and there's 330 plus million Americans that all want different things and unique things. And so the way you need to understand reality, I think, is to drill all the way down to the individual level and say, well, how do I think about what individuals want, and what unlocks individuals' potential, and what holds individuals back? And this is methodological individualism. This is like one of the foundational concepts underneath, the economics and philosophy of some of the work we've done, like the philosophy of Hayek and Mises and Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman and others, is to say, start at the individual level, start with one, and try to understand what's happening at that individual level. And I think the challenge we face when we make generalizations about groups, whether it's the police or whether it's about different ethnic groups, is we really undermine the dignity of the individuals that are part of that process. We are making broad generalizations that that are quickly falsified. That you can quickly poke holes in, because every generalization, even ones that have a fair amount of truth in them, don't hold up to any amount of rigorous scrutiny. And that would be my plea for what comes next when it comes to policies around everything we're dealing with right now, whether it's the police or any which way, is that I think we just have to not overplay our generalizations about other people, and not treat groups like monoliths. And I think that in a way is sort of the heart of the philosophical debate between a classical liberal and folks who, in one way or another, I think do find inspiration in the sort of framework of Marx. We did this rap video of Mises versus Marx, and we tried real hard to represent Marx's arguments fairly. And Marx was this polemicist, and I thought Mises was the perfect counter to Marx, because Mises was also strident and sort of a polemicist. And this methodology issue is at the heart of that debate, because Marx is fundamentally analyzing things at the level of class, that classes act, that classes have interests, that it's the workers versus capitalists, bourgeois versus proletariat, black versus white versus male versus female, gay versus straight. And that class mentality eliminates the possibility of treating people as individuals, because your individualism and your individual perspective on the world is it's subsumed by the group. And Mises comes at this and says, and he spends the first 100 pages of Human Action talking about this epistemological approach, is to say, no, that's not the way choices get made. That's not what's going on in society. That's not the mechanism here. There is no blob class proletariat in some battle with the bourgeois. That's a story. That's a story that's being told. That is linguist work. That's the work of words, not of reality. And I think that's the thing that scares me the most about how do we tell stories in a time of crisis like this. Because when our stories sandblast individual dignity and take those shortcuts, we head straight to Bedlam, and we head down a road that is well worn in the 20th century of dehumanization. And so, one of the things that I've been struck by, and that has started to really inform the kind of storytelling and the kind of projects that that we're trying to pursue as we, evolve our company and try to find ways to make the biggest impact we can with our work. And in a very real sense, we're a mission-driven company. We don't just exist. I mean, I'm sure we could probably make a lot more money going off and working for some big tech company than doing what we do at Emergent Order. But fundamentally, I've become much more interested in sort of the underlying psychology of the decisions we make and the way we come to the things we think about. One of the there's two books that have had a huge impact on the way I think about America and where we are in the world. One is Charles Murray's Coming Apart, which really paints a picture of a diverging society. And it doesn't diverge along the lines that a lot of people, often think, but it's a divergence that I really saw kind of firsthand as we drove around America for at the Fork. And that is like, you really do have we do have two different cultures that have emerged. One is sort of a cognitive elite class, people who don't work in physical, physical manufacturing and physical things, and live in towns like Inez, Kentucky, in towns like Austin, Texas, or Montclair, New Jersey, or New York, or DC, or Los Angeles, or the San Francisco Bay Area. And we watch HBO, and we have highfalutin sort of conversations, and we've never seen NASCAR, and many of us have never shot a gun, and drive tiny cars, and all of that. And I'm not trying to be, I'm summarizing sort of Murray's work here, but I think it's interesting because it maps against our politics in really interesting and challenging ways. And yet at the same time, this group is largely married and living kind of the old school American nuclear family. And then you have another America, a second America. And it's America that's become increasingly disconnected from the workforce. It's an America that, especially for men, where the men have sort of lost traction with how to be connected to progress. We touch on this quite a bit in our movie, The Pursuit. We visit Inez, Kentucky, and meet with former coal miners who've been displaced by change and are struggling with it. and also folks who've been marginalized in our society writ large, and people who've been through homelessness, and people who've grown up in neighborhoods and in parts of society where the escape hatches are limited. And we've split apart. And if we can't find a way to constructively come back together, it's pretty scary where that heads. And so our in the pursuit, we spend a fair amount of time just thinking about what does it mean to pursue happiness, and what does it mean to have a free enterprise system that lifts people up and that takes seriously the needs of those at the margin, and actually centers our energies around that. When I talk about like not analyzing things in terms of class and groups, it's deeply tied to our name. Our name is Emergent Order. And that is that order or harmony or progress can emerge from the bottom up. It emerges through a process that starts at the level of the individual. And I think it doesn't work as a top-down divide and conquer process. That's the path to destruction. The path to progress is Emergent Order. I mean, that's why we called our company what we called it. And so I think that that's one of the big challenges we face, is we have some forces that are driving us apart. We have some feedback loops in our society that are doing that too. And I don't lay all the blame of all of our ills on social media, but social media takes our physical separation and magnifies it into a digital separation and into a kind of self-fulfilling nichification of our ideas. And I don't think that's going to get us to the better future that I'd hope we can get to. One where, a disagreement isn't met with you're a fascist or you're a racist. That's not helpful. Nobody hears you're a fascist or you're a racist and says, no, tell me more. I want to engage what you just said and take it seriously and see what I can learn from that. Like, that is a path to nowhere. That is a nihilistic path to despair. And so I think that that's one of our biggest challenges in terms of the stories we tell, because I think there are some stories out there that lean into that. And there's stories we can tell about ourselves, about what we want to be, about what human nature is, that takes us in a different direction. And those are the stories that we want to tell at Emergent Order, and that we try to tell, that are, about how to unlock people's potential. And I know we've been going now for, a little over an hour. I'm going to talk about one new project in particular. And that's because I think that one of the things, there's a couple forces that are at work right now that I think have magnified the strife that we're experiencing. I think the biggest thing that's magnified it is the fact that we are plunged into a depression by COVID-19. That was a powder keg that was set up to burst. But the police brutality that's been happening was the perfect spark to light a fire. But I think there's deeper forces, psychological forces in the country that we need to really take a close look at. So one is this culture of fear. We've become a scaredy cat country. And I have seen that manifest in a very particular way. And the way I've seen it manifest is through parenting. I'm a parent. I have a 15-year-old son, and and I've seen the seeds of our current challenges in the cultural shifts that have happened in his peers. And so I've been working on a new film project about the way we raise our kids and the way that's changed, because what's happened is, and I'm still grappling with how widespread this is, because it's certainly concentrated around middle and upper class for sure. I don't know how much. I'm still grappling with to what extent these changes have manifested in working class families. And I think there's other challenges if you're, really at the margin and you're the working poor, you're, really at the edge of poverty. And that is, and I've interviewed several podcast guests about this, Lenore Skenazy and Peter Gray and Greg Lukianoff. And so about a year ago, I read The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. And in that book, they start with the question of why has college campus become this hotbed of protest, specifically around, the sort of shouting down of dissent. Why has what has traditionally been a safe space, if you will, for freedom of expression and for alternative voices, the sort of 60s Berkeley mentality, why has that flipped 180 degrees? And now young people are actively seeking what I've heard folks call epistemic closure. They don't, that, whether it's Jordan Peterson or Charles Murray, or other thinkers who sort of push on different lines of thought that are challenging to folks. Why has that suddenly become not just challenging, but actually treated like a physical threat? And what's underneath that? Because something has shifted, and it shifted relatively recently. And the book makes a very compelling case, which I've spent the past year diving much deeper into, about the way younger generations now have grown up. And so, I'm 42. I'm thoroughly Gen X. And so when I was a kid, my childhood, I think, looked like most American childhoods for the past 50, 60 years. I got home from school and I went outside, and I was basically free to do whatever the hell I want with very little structure or constraint. And, and so was all the other kids in the neighborhood. And, I have an Italian mother, which is just like a Jewish mother. So a super worrier, but she didn't worry that we were going to be kidnapped. She didn't stand by the door looking outside, there was no concept of having a play date. You just went out and ran around like crazy animals, and you figured things out. And we all, for those of us that grew up that way, we take for granted what that was doing. But what Peter Gray, this incredible psychologist, writes about in detail in his book Free to Learn, and you can hear about it more in our podcast, is that that freedom, that free play, is how we actually learn. It's how we learn to be functional people, and that it's where we get early, safe bumps and bruises that not just toughen our skin, but teach us how to interact with others. It's where, you invent a game and you have to build consensus to have the little made up game take place. And if it's too draconian, the other kids are not going to want to play it. But if the rules don't work, or if you're, they won't want to play. It's very hard to invent a game and have a bunch of kids that can run around and do something else, like stick in it and play. That's one lesson. You're beating each other up. I mean, I say this as a boy, but I mean, boys and girls together, you're having little spats and little scuffles, and you're surviving them, and you're learning that you can survive adversity. And this can sound like a privileged thing. And I think in many cases, I think it is a privileged thing to say that we need to learn how to survive adversity. It sounds totally tone deaf in a world where there are poor people dying in the streets unjustly, and say, I think there's more than enough adversity going around. And in a very real sense, that's unquestionably true. Guilty as charged to draw attention to that. But it's also true that we have lots of different problems happening simultaneously in our society, and they all matter. And I think this one matters a lot, because what I've sort of come to to see, and what I'm exploring in this new film, is the ways in which our fear as parents has translated into a real sense of fragility in young adults. There's increasing levels of suicide and depression, of anxiety and despair among my son's peers, and all around the country, and in the broader, mostly English-speaking West, and that has combined in a way that I think is quite toxic with a culture that is, I think, well intended, but that is a different kind of powder keg, and that is the culture of victimology, the sense in which being a victim is not merely something to be concerned about, something to have to confront when you are a victim, but that it's a badge of honor, and that it's actually a mentality you should lean into, and that you should integrate into your identity. And I know a lot of people who have been victimized, and in many different ways, physically, sexually, economically, and every strong person I know who's overcome these adversities has said that embracing being a victim is the path to hell. And you see that this is an insight that most people really understand in other contexts. So if you are a parent of a child with a disability, and the social workers that focus on this know that the number one thing you should be setting out to do is help encourage independence, not victimhood, not dependence. That is a muscle that you have to flex and learn from, and that it's essential to progress. And this is the same is true for people who struggle with drugs and alcohol, who also, I have many people close to me who have suffered through that. And that sense of overcoming your identity as an alcoholic or whatever, to a person who has that. You are a person first. You are an individual first. You are not an alcoholic. You are a person who struggles with alcohol dependency. You're not a convict. You are a person who has been incarcerated. That your identity isn't wrapped up in any of these things. That this is an essential. I think it's an essential ingredient to human progress, and it's an essential part of the psychological grappling that I'm increasingly doing with our projects, and with just trying to think about how to make the world a better place, and how to communicate that, and how to tell stories about it. And the interesting thing is, like, I got into this stuff around economics, and economics does a terrible job of confronting these challenges of identity and of personal motivation. It treats them like kind of like an assumption, there's a utility function, and why you're motivated doesn't really matter. In fact, motivations are sort of, trying to understand motivations are like in some ways the antithesis of economic logic, because it's saying that intentions matter, and the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And in many domains, your intentions don't really matter, your outcomes do. But when it comes to storytelling, and when it comes to trying to think about like the human condition, our intentions matter a lot. We don't judge characters by the outcome in a story. We judge them by their intentions, by their motivation. A recent example I gave, and I realize this sounds like I'm jumping all the hell over the place, but the movie John Wick is like the perfect example of this to me, because John Wick is a murderer. He's a paid assassin. He's a bad guy. And in all three movies, he goes about killing other murderous assassins. But we root for John Wick as the hero and the other people as the villains. Why? Like, why do we vote for John Wick as the hero? Like, if you're still paying attention, like, I pop a comment in. Why do you think John Wick is a hero? Like, why do we interpret him as a hero? I'll say what I think, and that is that it's all about his motivation. It's all about, he is the hero because he loved his dog and he loved his girl, and so exactly, yeah, Cyclone's got it. And also organically squared. Is it because he wants to quit? I mean, I think these are all things. I thought he was it was because he was a lunatic. Well, he is clearly a lunatic as well. But, I think the distinction from a storytelling perspective and from how do we interpret him as a character in a story is that he appears to be motivated well. His motivations matter. His intentions matter. So he decided to leave the guild or whatever it was called behind and stop doing contract killing. And he found a girl and found a dog. And so he had sort of turned the corner. And when his house is burned down and his dog is killed and he goes on a murderous rampage to avenge it, which is probably a little over the top as far as proportionality, we root for it because, well, these are all bad guys and he's the reformed good guy. But there is no difference between John Wick and the people he's killing, other than what we understand to be his motivation. And I think this for classical liberals like myself, for people who look at economics and they look at sort of public policy and they look at these debates around these big subjects, we cut across in this way and get confused about how to think about storytelling because at one level, and you could say identity politics plays into this, that like your motivations are what matters. Your identity, like who you are matters. Are you a good messenger or not? Are you well-intended? Are you or not? And if I don't think you're well-intended, I don't have to listen to anything you say. That's not an intellectually rigorous position to take. That's not good economics. It's not good rhetoric. But we have to contend with the fact that it's reality. We have to contend with the fact that as storytellers, this is the way stories work. We judge the good guys and the bad guys by their intentions. And it's real challenging to try to think about how do you tell good stories about issues that are difficult, issues like the protests we're going through, or our politics, or the future of our economic system, and bring those down to the level of an individual story, which in a way is very Mises, human action. Like the individual is making choices through the world and in the face of uncertainty. And so that's the perfect, in a lot of ways, Mises and his philosophy and his sort of methodology is very story centric because you want to understand individuals. You don't have blobs of groups of masses as the protagonist in a movie. That doesn't work. You need an individual that you can grapple with and understand. At the same time, you can really fall prey to false narratives when you break things down to the individual, when it just becomes anecdotal. And this is one of the biggest things I'm grappling with as a storyteller right now is how can I do a good job of tackling the subjects I care about. In the case of my next project, I'm working on now, our role as parents and our role as a society of creating a culture of fear and victimhood that has damaged our kids and set them up to be fragile, and therefore set them up to want things out of their lives that the world isn't prepared to give them, because the world doesn't care about you, because the world can't care. The world's not a being. The world is just the world. And so you have to go out there and you have to create your own care. You care as an individual. The world doesn't owe any of us anything. How do you grapple with that story and tell it at the individual level? And how do you find heroes for those kind of stories? And how do you guard yourself against confirmation bias and just picking the anecdote that suits the story you want to tell and leaving the other stories off to the wayside? one of the thinkers that's been a huge impact on me, and he speaks to this issue of what's happening with our kids, and is Nassim Taleb. And Nassim, one of his most recent books is called Anti-Fragile, and it's about what it means to be robust, to be strong. Like, what is the process that promotes? You could say promotes just human well-being. The first book I read of Nassim Taleb's was The Black Swan, and he points to a lot of things that are important for us to understand about ourselves and about our nature, and the way that we sort of misperceive probability and the likelihood of big risks, and that we can have these black swan moments that change everything. This COVID-19 pandemic is maybe a black swan moment. These protests and this movement that has gained momentum might be another black swan moment. But one of the recurring themes through his writing is the sense in which what we should want out of ourselves, out of our institutions, which is this weird word, institution, but our organizations, the rules of our society, the rules of the organizations that matter in our society, is anti-fragility. So what is anti-fragility? Well, the way he puts it is, to paraphrase, that you could say that something's fragile, like a porcelain cup. If you drop it on the ground, it will shatter. Now you can say something's robust, like this plastic bottle. If I drop this, it's not going to shatter. It's just going to bounce. So it's robust. But anti-fragile is a different thing. Anti-fragile is not simply that I can survive pressure and adversity, like dropping the bottle on the ground versus dropping the porcelain cup. Anti-fragility is that I actually get stronger through the confrontations with adversity. And I mean, we have a perfect example of the anti-fragility that we're grappling with right now. Our immune systems are perhaps exhibit A in the examples of anti-fragile systems. How do we come to fight off a new virus? Through exposure. That's how it works. A vaccine is actually a small, sort of attenuated piece of the very thing that is trying to kill you, to teach your immune system how to become stronger. With kids, we see this with the rise of peanut allergies. They've done repeated studies of this. And when you have a peanut allergy, or when you are marked as having a peanut allergy, and some people, it is a fatal thing, so you can't just start giving them peanuts. But the rise in peanut allergies correlates with the reduction of exposure to peanuts. So now you go to school and there's no peanut butter allowed, which sucks, because peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are one of the greatest things ever as a kid. But this is the problem that we're facing, is that we are raising a generation that doesn't get exposed to the things that will make them stronger. That is a generalization. There are some kids getting exposed to things that no kid should get exposed to. But even in those cases, sometimes if you talk to the survivors of the worst adversities we could imagine, yes, they can be screwed up in all kinds of ways, but they also might tell you that it helped them overcome the challenges that they faced in life. One of the therapies for peanut allergies is actually slow but increasing exposure to peanuts. One of the ways that we can overcome the fragility of our psyches now, and our ideological boxes, and our victimologies, and our and the identity politics that has gone too far on all sides, is exposure therapy. And I think that's the best part of what's happening in these, in this movement that's taking shape. I think to the extent that people can be exposed to dialogues and new ideas, that is making us anti-fragile. and in a positive way that's promoting progress. I think that's what competition does in markets. That's why markets work. It's not simply that the competition creates incentives for invention. It's that that give and take and that tumultuous, painful process of losing over and over again makes you stronger. It is the creation of a more anti-fragile society, one person, one company, one organization at a time. And I think we've lost a lot of that in the United States. And I think that this is the thing. If 10 years ago, the concern that animated Emergent Order as a company was this debate of Keynes versus Hayek and the macroeconomics. And I'm still every bit as interested in that subject as I've ever been. I think that this challenge of fragility versus anti-fragility and how will we expose ourselves to the experiences that will make us stronger and better people is the issue that's animating the next period for us as a company, and for me as a filmmaker and as someone who cares about philosophy. And that's what this live stream and in all its meandering was all about, is just sort of sharing that and talking a little bit about it, and sort of exposing myself to the world to get feedback on these ideas, because that's the exposure I want. I want to hear from folks about how they're thinking the world will get better, because it's pretty depressing out there. And I'm a rational optimist. I one of my favorite books is Matt Ridley's Rational Optimism. And we're pretty hardwired for negativity. We have these two things that are they're in a way, there may be one thing. It's fear. Fear is the force that it's our survival instinct, right? We're afraid of things that might kill us. We were animals in caves, and we were afraid of the dark because we couldn't see if there were snakes in the holes that we might walk through, or bears lurking, sleeping until we wake them. And we aren't that different as a biological entity. And yet we live in a world now where we see those dangers through a screen from 1,000 miles away. And our brain, I think, doesn't understand whether or not that is a threat to us or not. And so we are constantly having our fear put in our face. 24-hour news, it's its business model. If it bleeds, it leads. And so how do we create a new robustness, a new anti-fragility in an era of constant, incessant fear-mongering? I don't really know. I don't know the answer, but I know that if we just keep leaning into fear and demonization, I don't think the country survives in the way that I would hope for it to. And I say this as a parent more than anything else. And I don't think our relationships survive. And so that's the stuff that we're trying to grapple with. And it doesn't sound like the stuff of a company, but we're a weird company. And I think that's where the future lies for us, one way or another. We have to grapple with these things. I left TV behind because I thought there was an opportunity to apply the sort of creative skills of promoting TV shows to something that mattered more. And it's not that TV shows don't matter, but they don't matter quite as much as this stuff. Before we sign off, I'm going to take a look and see if there's any comments or anything that anybody would like me to touch on here, since we do have this interactive platform function. Anybody got something for me to opine on before we sign off for the day? I see one person said, have you grappled with Eric Weinstein's idea of embedded growth obligation? I was just exposed to this idea in a Joe Rogan podcast that I watched recently with him. So I don't know enough about. I mean, Eric is a pretty mind-exploding smart guy. So maybe we can see if he'll come on our podcast to talk about it some more. I do think that, again, as a free marketeer, it's really easy to just say, here's what we need to do. We need to have a minimal government that just protects people's individual dignity and property. And when I say individual dignity, I mean the equality under the law. So treat everybody equally and protect them and protect their ability to hold honestly acquired property for themselves, and the rest will work itself out. I mean, look at history. Look at the way the West was built. Obviously there's plenty of people who say, no, the West is built on a slaveocracy, and a lot of other terrible, horrible things. I would say that's all of human history, not unique to the West. And the West actually escaped that by things like the Magna Carta and the elevation of individual rights above petty tribalism. But I don't think that argument holds a lot of sway outside of a small systems thinking group. And that's a real challenge. I think anybody that calls himself a classical liberal or a libertarian has to take that challenge seriously. If your ideas aren't persuasive, how are they going to get out there into the world? How are they going to manifest in reality? And so, maybe this is not a real answer to the question of this embedded growth obligation or the Eric question, but I do think what I remember of what he was trying to grapple with was like, how do we have a capitalism that doesn't kill itself? And the way it might be killing itself now, to the extent, see, I'm even using that, those terms don't even make any sense, because capitalism is not a thing that can do things. But so the methodological individualist in me is sort of scoffing at my own words here. But there's something in the cycle of progress that tends to be a little self-defeating. Schumpeter talked about this. Minsky talks about it. It might just be, in some respects, multi-generational sort of forgetting that you can't escape. I don't know what the answer is. I think, but I think ideas still matter. I mean, that's why I'm trying to do these projects and, get out there in different ways. Let's see. I mean, I think here's the thing I'll end with. One of the other projects that I'm working on is taking my good friend Brian Kaplan's book, Open Borders, and turning it into some kind of film. It's a graphic novel. It's on Amazon. I strongly recommend it. It's a vociferous advocacy for effectively the kind of open borders that built the United States up until roughly 1924. And America is an incredible experiment. And one of the things that is the most exciting and unique thing about being an American, from my perspective, is we've managed to hold together as a pluralistic nation of immigrants. And that is very deep to me. It is one of, I think, the two magical inventions of America. I think the first invention of America that was special was, and I think it was somewhat accidental, federalism, this sort of competitive collection of states that can try things, and you can vote with your feet while still being American. I can say New Jersey is an oppressive environment on a lot of fronts. So I'm going to pick up and move to Texas, and I'm still an American. And that's a kind of diversity that makes us stronger as a nation. And I think that our diversity and the plurality of voices and cultures, there is no one American culture. There is no one American ethos, other than, my friend and film collaborator Arthur Brooks says we're a nation of ambitious riffraff. My family goes back to barely literate Southern Italian immigrants who came over as teenagers with nothing and built a family out of that, and were subjected to all kinds of trouble along the way. And obviously not everyone in America was brought here voluntarily. And we grapple with the echoes of that. I definitely believe we do to this day. But I think what made America special, and why I really chafe at narratives and stories that attempt to say that America sort of stands on fundamentally broken foundation, is that I don't think there is any other society that has sought to incorporate so many different people and done so successfully. And I find it strange when I see longing for the kinds of societies that are ethnically, culturally homogenous, whether it's wanting to be more like Sweden and Denmark or England or something. I think, like, why I just fundamentally disagree with that. I think that I disagree with the idea that we're a uniquely bigoted society, having traveled the world. I think bigotry is a universal, disgusting human quality, and that, like so many things I've talked about today, bigotry is subject to anti-fragility. And the more you expose yourself to other people, the more not merely tolerant, but the more exciting and the more accepting you are of diversity. And we see that in a lot of ways. We see it in the fact that I'm here in Texas, and Texas, by and large, isn't a very pro-immigration state, even as it is a red state. And that, whether it was George W. Bush or Rick Perry, they're Republican candidates who were very pro-immigration. And, and that is the anti-fragility of exposure. When you are exposed to other people with different experiences, different points of view, and whether or not they have different skin is part of the process, but is not the most important part. It makes you better. And I think that is the America that I care about. And so I want more of that America. I don't want us to splinter and collapse and crack up and come apart. I want us to find a way to let order emerge with diversity and with dignity and love. And so I think I'll sign off on that. I think for those of you that stuck through this for so long and got any value out of it, I thank you. I definitely, if you're watching and listening and haven't subscribed to the podcast, do that. We are going to keep doing this kind of stuff and having these conversations here on the YouTube channel, and we're going to keep sharing what we're working on, because it's a new world in media land, and I think it's exciting to share what's going on before it's a finished product. It's a new thing for me to do, but I think it's exciting, and I think it might open up new opportunities and new collaborations to be discovered. So I thank you for tuning in, and look forward to the next one. Thanks a lot.